Welcome back, everybody. This is the Resistance Broadcast. I'm John Hoey. Thank you so much for joining us today on a wonderful Thursday. We have a very special episode today. We have our first guest of 2019 joining us today. We'll introduce him in just a moment. So first, let's just say hi to James and Lacey. Guys, welcome back. How you guys doing?
I'm back. I was on leave last week, but I am back again, and I'm super excited to get into this deep dive discussion. Let's talk a little bit. Lacey, how you doing this week?
I'm geeking out right now, guys. We'll get to it in a second, but I'm geeking. So I'll let John get right to it.
Yeah, the reason why Lacey and James are geeking is our guest, who's a best-selling author who served as an author, editor, historian, archivist for Lucasfilm. And if you've seen any memes or GIFs or clips of behind-the-scenes crazy stuff from the original Star Wars trilogy and the prequel trilogy, it probably came from this guy's research and his books. So he knows a lot about Lucasfilm and Star Wars, so we're going to try to get as much info as we can out of him. Let's welcome in our guest, J.W. Rinzler. How are you? And thanks for joining us.
Welcome.
Hello.
Hello. Thank you for having me as your first guest of 2019.
All right. Well, yeah, first, before we get going, just, were you always a Star Wars fan? And in addition to that, how'd you get involved with Lucasfilm?
I guess to answer the first question, I guess I've always been a Star Wars fan, although not by today's definition of the word fan. I mean, it was a lot less strenuous to be a fan back in 1977. And I was I didn't know it, I don't think, but I was a George Lucas fan first, because the American Graffiti had as big or bigger effect on me than Star Wars did. I've said that before, but American Graffiti was just a revelation seeing it. It's the first movie that felt like it was addressed to kids who were watching it. It had fart jokes. And then, of course, it had the incredible soundtrack, and it was really exciting movie to go see at the time. And then when Star Wars came out, of course, it was as exciting. But in the first case, I went out and bought the soundtrack, and in the second case, I went out and bought some Super 8mm thing, which I tried to attach sound to and ended up burning it up in the projector. So both were, but I was probably, 77? So I don't know. I wasn't quite, I wasn't 8 years old when I saw Star Wars. I was a little bit older, so it didn't have that kind of impact on me. But I was always a George Lucas fan. And that's sort of how I ended up at Lucasfilm, was because I was living in France for a while, for so many years, and I was laid off from my job there, and I thought, I really should work at Lucasfilm. It's just an idiotic idea that occurred to me.
Just like, you know what? I'm just going to go work with my hero.
I just thought, I'd always been interested in movies, and it's a long story. I won't bore you, but anyway, I was going back to my first love in a way, and I thought I got this book by Tom Smith.
You were doing painting at the time, right?
I was, I had given up painting about a couple of years before that, because I just wasn't getting anywhere, and I needed to make a living because I had a 3-year-old daughter, and I was married, but we both needed to be working, and and I had also done what I had to do in terms of painting, and I bought Tom Smith's book used during a little vacation, and I realized that Lucasfilm was more than American Graffiti and Star Wars. That there was this whole company there, which of course mostly meant ILM to me at that point.
Yes.
And I thought, well, America at that point had almost zero unemployment, and France had something like 13%, and I thought we should go back there. And there were other reasons. So I did, and I got a job as a managing editor at GamePro, which I think sounds like you guys know about.
Yeah.
But my goal was to get a job. I'd heard about this place, Skywalker Ranch. I didn't know if it existed or not. I was, pretty naive or stupid, depending on whatever you want to say. And but at that time, Lucasfilm just posted their, and I think they still do, but it was really simple. Here are the jobs available, And so I'd look every, month or whatever. And I applied for 3 or 4 jobs before and didn't get them. I got an interview once in person at LucasArts, and then I got a phone interview for a job on StarWarsKids.com, and I didn't get those jobs, and I was disappointed. And then they had a job for editor, and I was managing editor, and that one I got an interview for at Skywalker, so I was pretty excited. And the interview went really badly at first.
What happened?
Yeah.
Lucy Wilson was interviewing me, and she was the head of the publishing department. She was also the first ever employee of Lucasfilm. She started in 1974. Her sister worked for Coppola, and when Lucas said he needed an assistant, her sister, I think, recommended Lucy to George, and she went and interviewed, and Lucy was everything. She did everything for years. And she typed up all the scripts for Star Wars. She was working at, the Lucasfilm office in San Anselmo, and so she was interviewing me. And she's very forthright. And I thought, this is going really badly. And I stood up and said, "Look, I don't want to waste your time anymore," because she said I was overqualified, which was news to me. And I said, "Okay, well, I don't want to waste your time." And she said, "No, sit down. I think we can work something out."
Is this by chance the interview that had to do with the expanded universe question?
Yeah, it was the same interview. Yeah, she asked me what the expanded universe was, and I said, "What's that?" I had no idea what it was. I mean, literally no idea. And she liked that because they had hired. It was always sort of a delicate issue at Lucasfilm because fans can go overboard if they're too zealous or whatever. And
wait, what? Fans go overboard? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, once they're working at Lucasfilm, and I saw that happen a couple of times with new hires. So, and the fact that I had gone to school in New York was a point in my favor. And so anyway, Lucy ended up hiring me, and we're still friends. We have dinner every so often. We ended up getting along really well. I think she's great. And when there was a going away party for her when she retired, George came, and obviously doesn't come to many of those. And it was at the main house at Skywalker Ranch, and he looked at all of us who were gathered there. There were about 40 of us, and he said, "When Lucy started, she did," and he put his finger and went like this. It's a video, so I can do this. He said, "She did all of your jobs." That was a very nice send-off. Mm-hmm. Anyway, so that's how I started there.
If I could ask too, I want to go back to that really quick because that part of the story was interesting to me that, she said, what do you know about the expanded universe? You said nothing. And that ended up being a good thing because you find that sometimes people who are too involved might not be the best for the job, or when their heart's in it too much. Would you say, in your opinion, just your personal taste, would you rather have someone who knows deep down the ins and outs writing Star Wars, or someone who just maybe doesn't know all the details or that much about characters and planets and things, but just kind of it writes a story that maybe fits?
You're talking about just as a writer, if I'm hiring a writer?
A writer of a novel, a comic series, a film, anything, just Star Wars, and this stuff will be the new story. This will be a permanent addition to the story.
I mean, it depends on what you need this person for. If we're looking, we would hire writers to write the Boba Fett series or something like that. We always look for somebody who knew how to write, first of all. And then who was a Star Wars fan. I think they had to know about Star Wars, because you can't bring somebody up to speed if they just don't know or care about Star Wars.
Yeah.
So they have to know about it. But the number one thing is they have to be good at whatever it is they're doing that you're hiring them for. That's the number one concern.
Cool.
I find that interesting because I saw an interview with you somewhere where you said, when you redid the Star Wars, the comic adaptation of the original draft of the first Star Wars movie, something, I don't know if this is true, George Lucas didn't like comic books that had dialogue It was visual only. Is that accurate?
Well, it's not like it wasn't that he didn't like comic books that had words, because most comic books have words.
Right.
It's just that we were working on this. He had this idea for a series of books that became Star Wars Art : I forget what the first one was, but whatever it was, the third or fourth one was comics. I think the first one was Visionaries. But anyway, there was a huge project that took years, and obviously I was doing lots of other things, but this was something that was, every day you'd spend an hour on or something. And when I was doing this project with him, he told me that what he liked mostly in comic books were the ones that told the story as visually as possible.
Okay.
And he singled out this Dark Horse story. I believe it was Dark Horse, where there's a little droid walking around, and it's all done as if it were a silent movie, and it was funny and it was poignant. So when I was doing the comic book, when I was trying to get him to do the Star Wars adaptation comic book, at first I just asked him, and he said no. I said, that's a terrible idea. something along those lines. Yeah. I think it might have just, anyway. But then I found out that Dark Horse also had the same idea, Randy Stradley, over there. And I said, well, look, because I didn't have a budget at Lucasfilm, strange as it sounds, I couldn't do what I could ask Dark Horse to do. Is I said, look, if you guys will hire an artist, and I'll write up a few scenes, and that artist will illustrate them, but with no dialogue, and I'll send those over to George, and I think I know which scenes he'll like, then I think we have a pretty good chance of him approving it. And that's exactly what happened. I just sent over as a memo. I think the guy did about 10 pages, and suddenly I'm blanking on his name. But it's in the the deluxe version you can get. And he did a great job. And George not only said yes, but he was excited about it. He wanted to see all the concept art. He wanted to see the script and everything. And I did the script, and I sent it over, and he approved it without making any changes. I added a couple scenes. Mm-hmm. But then he sold the company, and then he wasn't interested anymore.
Right. Mm-hmm. So I guess the most popular books with fans, especially with reusing the images, and like I was saying on social media, you probably can see your images that you dug up popping up everywhere. I use them often, especially the one with Peter Mayhew smoking a cigarette and Kenny Baker in the Playboy t-shirt. Just to bring levity to fandom.
The big one is usually
sometimes.
The sound guy in the pink short shorts in the middle of the desert.
Boom mic guy. Yeah.
That is the one.
People even cosplay as that guy at celebrations. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Poor guy was just hot. He was like, I'm just so hot out here.
He's like, no one will take this photo.
Yeah, I wish I could identify him.
He's out there somewhere, and he probably still has the same shorts. But when you look at making those books, I'm sure you've talked about your process of making them and going into the archives and probably being allowed to have access and not too much limitations. But when you compare, I guess, the making of, and this is just a question for me here, the original trilogy to the prequel trilogy, what tonal differences did you notice in George himself, the people around him, and did the people around him affect his creative process, and how was he different over the course of the original and prequel trilogies?
Well, that's a good question, but it's a big question. And
well, we could talk about it, yeah.
Well, in terms of the books, you can't really compare, because writing the episode 3 book, I was there. And, it was more a different process. I would just be there for hours at a time in all the different situations. And, you basically, somebody said something interesting, I'd jot it down discreetly, and then, later put it in the book. And it took 3 years, more or less. And then the other ones were research projects. So, and using, depending on which one, the first one was primarily Charlie Lippincot's interviews, because those were done before the fact, most of them, and it was fantastic. And then the second one was also mostly archival interviews, and the third one was a mixture, because there were strangely enough, fewer archival interviews. So I did a lot more. But in some ways, that book is my favorite because we had the process down of how to make one of those books down pretty well by that time.
Return of the Jedi?
Return of the Jedi, because you make mistakes and you hopefully learn from them.
Sure.
But the people, everybody's talked about it, and the people, and he changed a lot. I mean, it was in some ways night and day. I mean, in the beginning, he was hungry. He was making the first one. Nobody thought it would work, including the people working on the film, most of them. Only the art department in England and a few of the ILM people thought.
And that guy in the pink shorts.
Well, those guys were just doing a job, most of them. And the camera crew was actually fairly hostile to George because he wanted to sort of handle the camera and look through the viewfinder and things like that because he came from the I do everything independent filmmaking school like he'd done on THX and Graffiti. Mm-hmm. And, Gil Taylor had worked with Hitchcock and any number of brilliant filmmakers. And who is this American guy in sneakers wanting to take control of his camera?
Who still wears those sneakers?
Yeah, he still does. The jeans and the plaid shirts. Yeah. And also, and George, I once saw George say on stage, he was on stage with Francis Ford Coppola and Walter Murch, and he was talking to an audience, and he said, at that time, the question of whether you're going to succeed in making your film was a live or die question. That's how strongly they felt about it, all three of them. It was a question of life or death, making that film. And so that's a fairly serious question. And his whole being was dedicated to that first film. And already by the second one, it was a little bit less because there were other things going on because of the success of the first one, and even more so by the third one. And so already you have George being somewhat diminished. That said, at each stage of making all the films, including episode 3, the last one, he was there he was very into it. It's not fair to him to say that he wasn't. Okay. Because he was. He just wasn't like the first one, which was, if the first one was 150%, maybe the other ones, depending on what they were between 65 to 85%. I don't know. That's, just arbitrary numbers. But I saw him in episode 3 the whole time, and he was very seriously into it.
Wow.
It was very important to him. And I'd sit by him while he did the animatics. And he would spend sometimes 2 hours on a shot that was maybe a second and a half.
Oh, my God.
Making sure that every single... this was mostly for shots of battle sequences, like at the opening, the whole waterfall shot. When they're in the Jedi Starfighters. Each roll of the ship was in relation to where the other ship was in the background and the other ship that's flying and where things are exploding and how it relates to the shot before and how it relates to the shot after. And if for my money, that opening sequence is worth the price of admission alone. And like the one, the asteroid chase in episode 2, those are masterpieces of filmmaking, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree.
You can compare them to most any other sort of film where there's a starfighter, dogfighter or something, and see the difference. There's not a single wasted centimeter of celluloid or digital space, shall we say, in the Star Wars ones. And that's quite an accomplishment. And he cared deeply about them. And then there were people on them all throughout, people like Ben Burt and Dennis Murin, who also cared deeply about what they were doing. And you had John Williams, of course. So you had a core team that was there throughout. And the key person, I'd say, from the early stuff is Marsha Lucas. She was the one who thought that somebody should die. Well, I think she and him, George, sort of came up with the same. I don't know who came up with the idea first, but she also thought that somebody should die when they go on board the Death Star. You can't all survive, and so otherwise it's not really a scary place.
Right.
Right.
It's not a dangerous place. And so they killed off Obi-Wan while they were on on location in Tunisia. And that changes the whole movie.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, it changes the whole movie that you have the whole, and I've talked about this before, but it changes everything because then Obi-Wan Kenobi is teaching Luke that that the spirit goes on, which otherwise is not in the movie. And that's hugely important in the Star Wars mythos. And,
I think that gets lost on people because a lot of people think Alec Guinness was not really in love with the role, and he liked the idea that he was getting a box office draw. That maybe he said, "Kill my character off, so I don't have to come back and do any more of these."
No, that's exactly the contrary was true. When George told him he was getting killed off, Alec Guinness almost quit, and that's in the book.
Yeah.
They went out to lunch when they were back in London, and George had to talk him out of quitting because he was saying, I die and I don't get a death scene. He's an actor. The actors.
I've never really thought about that. Like, you're alive, and then you just aren't. You're not alive. You're gone.
Yeah, and then he's just a disembodied voice, and he also didn't like the idea of being a ghost because he was a Roman Catholic. So George had to say, "You're not a ghost. It's not what's happening." And so
That's not what's happening.
Yeah, and then it's definitely known to be a Force ghost. That's how people see it. Yeah.
Right. Well, it's all words, but he talked Alec Guinness into it. I wish I could have been there for that lunch. That would have been interesting.
Yeah. Oh my God.
So yeah. So go ahead.
No, I was going to say, because that brings up the point of how important your books are. And I saw a quote with Dennis Muren, who said the work that you did was so vital because as generations go on, including our generation, a lot of this stuff we aren't aware of, even with these books existing. So you punt this thing down 20 years down the line, these stories are going to get lost. And, they're praising what you did in bringing up these archives because they could have been collecting dust and rotting away in the basement forever. So
would have been.
Do you realize, I know, you seem like a very humble guy, but do you realize the effort that you put in, the permanent lasting effect you could have on the legacy of the original trilogy and even the prequel trilogy?
No, I don't. It's nice of you to say all that, but no, I don't. George had kept all this stuff. It's like you had all the pieces to build a great Ferrari, and nobody was putting it together. He'd kept the stuff, and I was lucky enough to be there, and long enough to and realize where there was this in that department, and this is in this archive, and the legal, and I knew who to ask in the legal department. So a lot of stuff just came together, and like you said, the Lippincott interviews were just gathering dust. But then for the Empire book, I don't know why, I was in the archives doing something, and Don Bees was there. And this is in the Empire book, it's in the introduction. But I said, I'm going to write the Empire book. And Don Bees said, I have the original tapes that from the Empire interviews that remind me who did. I'm sorry, I should have brushed up on all this stuff. Who wrote the Empire making of? I can't remember his name. But whoever wrote that did all these interviews. And Don Bees was in the archives, and they were and saw the tapes in the garbage. They were in the garbage.
Oh, what?
And he thought, these shouldn't be in the garbage. And he took them home and put them in his closet.
Wow.
And that was probably in the late 80s or something.
Oh, my goodness.
And so then, roughly, whatever it was, 20 years later, he offered them to me. And then we put them back in the library, in the archives, and we had them all transcribed. So again, it was just, call it fate. As Obi-Wan says, doesn't happen by accident, but I was just sort of doing the best I could. And all this stuff kept sort of rolling towards me. The same with the blueprints. I was there and this guy, it was the first time that the blueprints were literally being unrolled. And it was just, on the other side of the archives. And Steve said, look at these. These are really cool. You should do a book. And I said, you're right. I should do a book.
Yeah.
And then
I get the impression that that's how they keep things. They just say put that in the garage. And then no one looks at it for 30 years. And it's just all there, but it's none of it's cataloged.
Next to the
until
Grail.
Someone catalogs it. Yeah.
Right. And that's that's why when we did the enhanced version of the making of books, we found the sound to the blooper reel for Star Wars first, but we had no idea where the picture was. You know,
I can't even imagine the
That's
kind of stuff
interesting.
that's gotten thrown out over the years from
Oh,
all
God.
different types of movies that people are like, whatever, and they just like throw it out.
I know it's there's been huge amounts of stuff, wonderful stuff lost, and
Oh,
but that's the way civilization goes.
right,
So-
right.
You were talking about the prequels and that you were there for episode 3. So I have to ask, because I'm the most interesting person surrounding that trilogy to me is Rick McCallum as executive producer, because he's always seems to be in all the interviews, and he seems on the outside like a very George Lucas yes man, like whatever George wanted, he was 100% behind. Is that accurate, or was he more of did he ever combat George's ideas, or was it just kind of whatever George says goes, and for good or for bad?
No, Rick was definitely his own person, and quite a formidable character. When I got there, when I first started, they said, you're the nonfiction editor, and that means the behind the scenes books, which is how this whole thing started, which I didn't know.
Yep.
And they said, and here's the episode 2 manuscript. You get to go see Rick. And that was one of the reasons why I was hired, is nobody wanted to go see Rick for anything.
Why is that? Why is that?
He used to if he got something, I don't know exactly what would trigger it, but he would start screaming, and his assistants, would quite literally hide under their desks.
Oh my God.
And he was a rampaging, madman, as most producers are, because to get things done, you often have to scream at people. That's the sad truth. Mm-hmm. And people have to be basically afraid of you. I remember, I won't say which film, because there were many films, but there was somebody at the end of it was like the last day they were shooting a film, and he didn't do something that, I'm not sure who asked him, and Rick found out about it and fired him on the spot.
Wow.
Because you even if it's the last day, it's serious. And everybody who's been on a film set equates it with the military, and of course nobody's getting killed, or hopefully not. But
Right.
it's a very tense and scary place to be at times.
Wow.
And if you don't know what you're doing, you're out of there very quickly. And so no, Rick was, it was obviously George was calling the shots. George was paying for it, and he was the visionary guy behind it all. But and I wasn't there all the time by any stretch of the imagination, but I know people who were, and Rick definitely had ideas, and there were definitely conflicts. And George came to him to do the Young Indie TV show, and that Young Indie TV show is kind of forgotten because it's for whatever reasons, but that show broke a lot of ground. The sort of the gospel, and maybe I'm too much of a Lucasfilm person, but ex-person or ex-Lucasfilm person. But what I sort of saw and seemed to me is that sort of paved the way for a lot of the miniseries and all the sort of TV shows like The Crown now. Because George, they spent a lot of money, and they filmed on location all over the world. And they got a lot of directors who went on to direct lots of great things, and they had a lot of good writers, and a lot of actors got breaks on that show that went on to do great things. And that was, Rick was running the show. George was back at the ranch. He didn't want to be out there in Africa. Rick was quite literally making deals with warlords in countries so that they could shoot in certain places.
Now I understand why he's so yelling all the time. Maybe he just learned that.
I'm going to hide under my desk right now just hearing these stories.
Yeah, no, I mean, I was there at episode 3. It was a day before the release, and George was adding the shot of Anakin's mechanical hand during the wedding scene. And what wasn't there in the film prints. But it wasn't too late to make a change and get it for the whatever it was, I forget how many digital
the day before
digital theaters. It was the day before, and I was in the office, and Rick was talking to a visual effects person, and or production person. I can't remember exactly what their title was, and this person was saying, I don't know if we can do this. And Rick just exploded, and he said, "You want to tell George you can't do the shot?"
Oh,
and that
man.
person was gone. And that shot
sounds
is
like
in the movie.
Steve Jobs or something, you know?
Well, that's the kind of craziness and the kind of it's not really, well, I guess there's
genius.
an element of craziness in it, but it's also just it's very high pressure, and you have a lot of AAA personalities running around. You really have to be very careful in those environments.
Was George Lucas a type A personality?
Definitely.
Yeah, because he seems like a passive guy, but
no, he doesn't. It's not like he's all the time. Some people are more intense all the time. George is very laid back, but if he thought that he was not, getting what he wanted, and he could even be laid back for a while, but eventually, and George told me this himself. George said, if I wanted a camera crew fired, Rick would do it. And he would have a new he would fire them in the afternoon. I'd have a new camera crew there in the morning, and that's what a director wants and needs. It's cutthroat. It's not a fun. It's not a, people are loyal and nice in the business too, but it's also extremely cutthroat, and people,
I'm not risking this film
Millions
on
and millions
the
and millions
livelihood
of
of these few camera people or whatever. Like, I have to make it for myself because I'm putting the
my name on
everything
this.
in. Yeah, everything in on this. So it's understandable, but it's crazy when you think, sometimes when you think about the guy who's getting fired because of a minor mistake or something like that.
yeah, I got canned by George Lucas. I'd put that on my resume.
Yeah, I came close to being fired by George a couple times.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Did you mouth off to him? Or you're like, George, get out of here.
No. It was just both times. I was just once it wasn't really my mistake, but we were doing this book. We were doing the Frames book, and it was just me and George talking about it. And I said, but it's not me. It was this other person. And George said, "I am talking to you."
Oof.
And afterwards, I understood, and that's the way it is with the producer too. In the sense, I was producing this book for him, and he's not going to call the person doing the printing, or he's not going to call the person who's doing the design. You are the conduit, so you are responsible for everything. And if it's screwed up, you are fired. Wow. And so that's what I understood. That it took, I was a little bit maybe slow on the uptake, but I figured it out. And then the other time I made a mistake, it was sort of debatable. It was kind of my mistake, kind of George's mistake, but mostly my mistake, and it cost money, and he still didn't fire me. But I was pretty sure I was fired at that point.
Does George have a good sense of humor?
Oh, yeah.
What's his sense of humor like? Is he dry or?
It depends. We occasionally I would just sort of look at him and go, blah, and he would too. So I don't know what kind of sense of humor that was.
I want a video clip of that so bad.
Yeah.
Actually, no, the funny thing is, the reason why I remember is I have a photograph of that moment of us both going like that. But anyway, I'm not going to put that online because I don't think I have the rights to it. But anyway.
So we can use it as the episode header photo then. Okay.
Yeah.
But he's American Graffiti, I guess, would probably be a good look at his sort of what his sense of humor is like. Mm-hmm. Star Wars is funny. I think Dave Filoni has told this story too. Maybe I shouldn't tell it because maybe it's Dave Filoni's story. But
you can if you want. Yeah.
No, but I just don't want. I don't want this to come back and bite me.
Dave Filoni told a story over the summer at San Diego Comic-Con about Yaddle and how he made a comment about Yaddle, and George was like, "Don't talk about Yaddle."
Yeah. Well, and George couldn't stand Mara Jade. And he just couldn't stand. He couldn't. They went out and got some sort of person who looked like she had stepped out of a Cosmopolitan magazine to be the model for Mara, and he just thought the whole thing was so not Star Wars and not his vision of Star Wars. And once, I forget, I think Sue Rustoni, who was doing the novels, told me they were killing off Mara Jade. And I said, "Ooh, I get to tell George." And I said,
George had a party that night. He was like,
"They're killing off Mara Jade." And to me, it was very funny because George's attitude was he didn't say anything, but you could tell he was so happy, and it was very, very funny. So,
so if Mara Jade were to show up in the new episode 9, you're saying George Lucas wouldn't run out to the theaters to go see it?
Well, yeah, I don't know how George feels about the new movies. That's a whole other topic of discussion.
That's so funny because she's such a fan favorite character for some reason. Like, people always harp on it. So for George to be like, I really don't like that character. Like, it's just
well,
funny.
And also she married Luke, and
right.
he said, Jedi don't marry.
Right.
Yeah.
So for him, that was important.
So Luke's, that's funny because they keep saying, a lot of people, and to this day, they're like, oh, that Rey is Luke's daughter. And that goes against Lucas's thing too, I guess, to a point. But the EU thing, like, there's a lot of fans who are pissed about the new movies or the new canon because they got rid of the EU. But, but by what you're saying and what, we've heard is George he allowed that stuff, but he didn't consider it canon anyway, right?
George had a very healthy attitude towards the EU and licensing in general. I mean, licensing starting after episode 1 just became this juggernaut that was making just truckloads and truckloads of money for Lucasfilm.
You don't say.
So you don't bother licensing.
Yeah. Okay.
And he had good lieutenants running licensing, and they asked, they would just ask him if something, in particular they thought maybe George might care about. And basically he gave everybody a full head of steam. And his attitude was, do what you want. Don't talk about Yoda, or for this movie, I'm going to be probably doing that, so don't talk about that. And that was it. And then you did your thing, and then he did his thing. And then if it contradicted the EU, Leland and would get together with publishing and say, okay, how can we fix this? And it'd come up with some retro reversed engineered fit. I mean, it was make-believe. It is make-believe.
Right,
so people didn't get very uptight about it. And George also used ideas from the expanded universe. He was interested in it, but it wasn't the movies. There was the movies and there was everything else. Or there was the Clone Wars TV show and there was everything else. There was what he was doing and everything else. But if he took stuff from what other people were doing all the time, it was his intellectual property, and he would take stuff and change it or expand upon it. It was a very healthy system.
So
I'm actually glad you. Well, go ahead, John.
I was just gonna say, so he understood the business side of it, and like Harrison Ford said, you can't kill me because you can't sell more action figures if I'm dead. The whole thing with the EU, it's like George almost felt like it was his baby, and he wanted the ultimate control, but he understood letting other people play in his sandbox, I guess. Is
right,
the ultimate
exactly.
way to look at it. Okay.
He was very democratic.
Except Mara Jade. She can get out of here.
He didn't like Mara Jade. But, he didn't come to licensing and say, you have to kill her off. He just said, I'm not happy about it. But he didn't.
And when she does die,
right. But George, he had bigger fish to fry. He was trying to change filmmaking by advancing digital technology. He wasn't going to get involved in the minutia of the expanded universe. He quite literally had better things to do.
And all of that still applied to the Clone Wars too. There were probably plenty of stories written, but he kind of rewrote them as that series continued.
Well, I think, you do sort of get into that kind of passive George versus hands-on George. I think he was kind of passive, but then he would get kind of hands-on during the first and second season, or maybe just the first season. You'd have to ask Dave. But it created problems because it's hard to fix things and change everything once you've animated them. So starting, definitely with the third season, and I was part of the writing team for the fourth season. you spend 2 weeks in a room with George, and he would come with the germ of the plot for each episode or episode arc. And then you'd write it on the board, and then everybody would pitch ideas, and you'd work out what the story was. So he was very much, I think he really, really enjoyed working with Dave and really, really enjoyed making the Clone Wars. And there are a lot of interesting ideas in there. Because he did ultimately want to do and did end up doing what Gene Roddenberry did, which is create a cast of characters and then address ideas and tell different stories with the same group of characters. Although often those characters change characters because to suit the story. It's subtle, but it happens. I always say Star Wars is actually 3 movies or 3 story arcs. There's the first one, which is really a part of a trilogy, which is THX, American Graffiti, and Star Wars. Have you guys heard me go on about this before? You can stop me.
No.
Keep
Go
going.
ahead, please.
Those are all stories about leaving home. Every one of them, and then, or at least partially, and then, and in the first one, Darth Vader is not Luke's father. Then in episode 5 and episode 6, George did a movie about compassion and forgiveness, and Darth Vader is now Luke's father, and Leia becomes his sister in episode 6. Then for episodes 1, 2, and 3, he decided to tell the story about how a good kid goes bad and how a democracy becomes a fascist dictatorship with the same characters, but they're not the same. And it works together, and George would violently disagree with me, but George does sometimes, dig his heels in, but at other times he might, be easier to talk to about certain things. And on the set of episode 3, he told me, and this is in the book, and he read the book, that to him each film is like a block, and you can put the blocks in different orders and they tell different stories, and he loved that idea. But later I wanted to do a documentary as like an extra thing for one of the Blu-ray things, and we asked him whether we could talk about that, and he said no, there's only one way to tell the story, and that's 1 through 6. So it just sort of depends on the day. It depends how he's feeling.
I have a question for you about that whole process going through the writing on Clone Wars. Is that I heard you say once before that you wrote the story, or you were handed the story by George, and you kind of mentioned that earlier. George kind of wrote the outlines, and then you would go in, and on your particular episodes, there was sort of a redeem or kind of rehabilitate Jar Binks kind of thing.
Right.
And then a lot of that story, I guess, what was originally your ideas got changed or moved around, shifted around by Dave and the team at hand. What ideas did you have that didn't make the show?
Well, it's a little bit, it's not exactly what happened. I mean, George said to me in the elevator going up one day, he said, "You have to rehabilitate Jar Binks." Those were pretty much his exact words. Which is funny. Which is funny, and which also shows though how much he cares again about his characters. He loved Jar Jar, and he loved all the characters, and except Mara Jade. And he didn't play her.
That's not his character.
There it is.
But all the ones that he created, he loved them, and particularly Yoda. But we worked out the story together. It was George, Dave Filoni, I think Christian Taylor is the lead writer, and me, and in a room working out the story. But then there was some sort of disagreement, not with me but with them, as to whether it should be more of a Temple of Doom kind of thing with sort of a Star Wars story a la Temple of Doom. So the story kind of got turned around a couple of times. But the ideas were all of ours to begin with.
Okay.
I don't remember which ones were mine. But then what happened was, and this I think happens to a lot of scripts, is once the director came on, they changed it around a good deal. There's hardly anything of what I actually wrote left in the show. And it's the kind of thing that happens. And I don't know if mine was particularly worse than anybody else's, or it just went a different way. I didn't think it was that bad.
I wanted to ask you about, because I believe you had done an interview with one of our writers at Star Wars Newsstand a few years ago, and you were still pretty close to your departure from Lucasfilm, and you probably didn't want to speak as much about certain things. But when it comes to treatments, and we've heard George Lucas in interviews recently talk about stuff of his ideas, what they would have been for a sequel trilogy, and there were always rumors of 12 stories or 9 stories, and then sometimes him saying just the 6 stories, as you just said. But we knew treatments existed, and he offered them, and they allegedly rejected them. Can you speak on that and what you think they might have looked like in comparison to what we have now with the sequel trilogy stories?
Well, I can't. I mean, I've read his original treatment for the 7, 8, and 9. I mean,
so you could just email that over.
Yeah. It was
Mara Jade, a Star Wars story.
Right, exactly. How to kill Mara Jade in 10 easy lessons. The problem was there was only 3 lessons per film, so he had an extra lesson. No, what happened was, George went on record, I think before the first one, even before episode 7 came out, even saying that his ideas were being discarded or not paid attention to. So I can't remember what's the question.
So, what can you speak on about his treatments that you're allowed to possibly give us hints about or even tell us about? And how would you compare them to what we have with the current stories that are happening via JJ and Rian Johnson and JJ?
No, I just can't. I can't talk about it.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
That's fair.
Sorry.
Would you say it's vastly different than what we have?
I just prefer not to say anything.
Okay,
It's
no
just,
problem.
Yeah.
It's just a it's just a minefield for me.
That's
no
fine.
problem.
My question
No
was
problem.
going to be, what's your favorite Star Wars movie?
But that's an easier
I was going to
question.
steer
Thank
you in a completely different direction.
For me, this is the first one, the 1977 one, because we went from nothing to a full-blown universe. You had John Barry doing the production design, and George, of all the people George has worked with, John Barry is one of those he had the most respect for. John Barry had worked with Stanley Kubrick, and he was the one who got George through making a movie on a soundstage. George had never really done that kind of movie before. He sort of did with THX, but American Graffiti there was not a single soundstage used anywhere in that movie, I don't think, offhand. So it was a whole different kind of movie making.
Based?
It was I'm pretty sure everything Graffiti was filmed on location. And they were also very small budgets, less than $1 million. And suddenly he was making a movie that was going to end up costing $10 or $11 million. And he had a studio breathing down his back. And it was a totally different thing. And he, on that movie, you can go on and on. It's amazing what he did on that movie. He started his own visual effects company, ILM, which ended up changing the industry completely. He started up his own sound design and editing company, which is now Skywalker Sound. And they've worked on thousands of movies. And and the way he treated Ben Burt as an integral part of the team, and had him putting on temporary sound mixes to go back to the editors, and they would re-edit based on what he'd done. So there was a very holistic process, which incidentally is hardly anybody does, to my knowledge. Most people just stick on the sound at the end almost as an afterthought. And sound is so important to the Star Wars movies. So he did that. Then he was also fighting for better quality in all the cinemas. You guys, I believe, are too young to remember what it was like going to see the movies in the late 60s and early 70s. It was a very hit and miss affair. The sound could cut out, the film could stop, the projector could go black. You might have half the sound. You might hear only a couple of the voices and not all the people in the scene. You might have one thing working on one side of the theater but not the other. Scratches up and down the film if you came the third week. I mean, it was a totally different experience. And
oh my gosh,
George and Kubrick and other film directors who had power fought to change all that. And George created a whole company called TAP, the Theatrical Alignment Project, I think, that went out and tried to change that and did a pretty good job. And the people that were working on Star Wars went on to do all sorts of things, start their own companies. You know, if you did a family tree, it's just phenomenal. And he took unknowns. You know, people forget that all those, Carrie Fisher, nobody knew who she was.
Right.
The cast was basically unknown. And
Harrison Ford was a carpenter.
Yeah, Harrison Ford had basically failed as an actor. He was working as a carpenter.
Yeah.
And he didn't do it all by himself by any means. He had help all along, but he was the filter and he was the driving force. And also George has this very subtle way, and there's no way I can describe it, but people want to do things for him.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if he showed up in my house and asked me to kill Mara Jade, I'd do it. I'd do it for him.
Yeah.
But looking back on your career and all the films you've watched and interviews you've listened to and photos you've looked at, is there any moment within all that work that you're like, this is a really cool moment? Like a favorite photo or video or anything like that you watched that you were like, this is so cool?
You mean just from when I was working at Lucasfilm, or
when you were working on the books, like the making of books and stuff?
It happened all the time, but I think one of the things that was really cool, it just pops to mind, was when we were making episode 3. At a certain point, Rick cleared the set and he said, "You can stay." And Hayden arrived dressed as Darth Vader, and
snap!
And I think the guy got up on a ladder to film him. And they did the scene. George was redoing the scene with new dialogue from episode 5, you know, in order to take into account things that they didn't know were part of the story back in 1979. And so suddenly I was there, in a sense, watching George shoot part of episode 5. That was really cool.
Was
that with McDiarmid doing the Emperor, or was that something else?
Yeah, McDiarmid, he was there doing the Emperor, yeah. But the thing is, I think the camera was mostly on during that. It's in the episode 3 book. I think it was the camera was mostly on Darth Vader, but you'd have to look it up. But then,
so cool.
Yeah, that was pretty cool.
I'm trying to understand that a little bit better. You're saying that Hayden on the set of episode 3 was reenacting scenes from episode 5?
He wasn't reenacting them. He was doing it so they could insert, like in the Blu-ray. If you watch episode 5, that's Hayden Christensen in the Darth Vader costume in the scene where they're talking about Luke, like what to do with Luke.
Oh,
what?
So
what?
Because I knew
I knew that.
I didn't know that.
It's not a secret. It's right in the episode 3 book.
Oh, I believe you.
Yeah.
So I knew they replaced Clive Revell with McDiarmid for continuity's sake, but I just thought they punched him in there, and there was David Prowse on his knee still. But you're saying that's crazy.
Well, you know, I don't know exactly what shot. I wasn't there when they edited the whole thing back together.
Oh, sure.
But they were reshooting it, and Hayden was in the Darth Vader costume. It could be that it's still David Prowse in some of the shots and Hayden in 1 or 2. I really don't know.
Or they could have used Hayden as just a stand-in so McDiarmid could hit the mark right or something.
Right, because this week Ryan Johnson was talking about how it's his hand, not Luke's hand, that pulls the dice down. So maybe it's like one of those things in the newer movies.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of weird stuff that I just wrote the book on the making of Alien.
Nice.
There's a scene where the captain goes in to talk to Mother and says, "Good morning, Mother," and they just couldn't get the actor to loop that line, and so Ridley Scott just says it. You know, so it's just Ridley Scott's voice.
I like old school stuff like that, though.
Yeah.
It's just it's so organic.
Got to get it done. Yeah. That's so
Yeah.
cool. So do we have fan questions, John?
Yeah, we have fan questions. One other thing I wanted to talk to you briefly about, if that's all right. You have said you haven't seen the recent movies, right? So you haven't seen Solo or The Last Jedi, is that correct?
Right. I saw the first two, Force Awakens and
Rogue One.
Yeah.
What did you think of those two movies?
Well, to me, they weren't my cup of tea.
Okay.
Yeah. I thought the first one had some good, funny parts, but there were parts that I didn't like as much.
Okay, and then I guess my last question before our fan questions, do you have any inkling of what, because there's obviously a lot of unrest with Disney and Lucasfilm and stuff, a lot of drama going on. Do you have any kind of ideas as why you think there may be drama and issues going on between the two companies or with Lucasfilm in general?
Can you let me? Because I really don't follow. What's the latest drama?
So, I mean, you've heard, I don't know if you've heard, but they've had directors fired during production of the Solo movie. They had, Colin Trevorrow was supposed to do episode 9. He got fired and they brought back J.J. Abrams. There's, rumors of this person doing
Josh
that movie,
Trank
this person doing that
the
movie.
Boba Fett movie.
And issues between Disney with Bob Iger and Kathleen Kennedy over how Solo was marketed. So there's a lot of stuff going around about issues between Disney and Lucasfilm, and a lot of issues with Lucasfilm in general and how these movies are being made, with directors being fired. So is it a Kathleen Kennedy thing? Is it a Disney thing? Do you have any kind of perspective on what could be going on nowadays?
Is it just too corporate?
Well, I would just say it's just movie making as usual.
Yeah.
I don't think there's anything happening. It doesn't happen on any high budget movies. I mean,
I just think it's under a microscope more than
it's
other
under a
movies.
microscope.
Yeah.
Exactly. I think
JW is sitting here like, so where's the drama?
well, it's really dramatic if you're involved. I mean, it's not so much fun to be fired, and it's.
He's like, let me call Rick.
I mean, directors are fired. It's obviously not an ideal situation, but it happens all the time. Or they leave for creative reasons. That's the euphemism, as you know. And actors get fired sometimes after filming for a couple of weeks. It's a very tough business. And writers, I mean, they usually go through your standard movie, even back to the 30s, would go through very often 3 or 4 or up to a dozen writers. It's just. It's a high body count when you're making movies. I doubt that it's anything out of the ordinary, but I really don't know because I'm not there anymore.
Okay, that's fair. We do have a few questions. If you don't mind, we have 3 questions from a couple of our lucky listeners, if that's all right with you.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So, Lacey, do you want to ask him? Do you want me to ask him?
No, you can ask him. Go for it.
All right. So this is from Katie Bowie at Katie_Bowie. And they said, did you actually complete your work on the making of The Force Awakens? Some speculate it was canceled because they didn't want George's ideas getting out, but they could have just edited that info out and given us, the fans, what they wanted us to know. So anything about a making of the Force Awakens book, and was it canceled? Did it exist? Anything about that?
I was done with the manuscript. The manuscript was complete. The design, the book has sort of been designed, but the design wasn't complete. And, the first couple of people who read it really liked it, and I got positive emails. And because it was a couple of months after I had officially left the company, and then I was just told it was canceled, and I really don't know why.
Oh, okay. So you never got like an official reason. Like
no,
this is
I was
why.
not given any reason at all. No,
because it was still in production as you left, and then when they decided to cancel it, there's no reason to tell you why because you don't even work.
Right, exactly.
For the company?
I was just a hired gun at that point.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
But the book was complete, and it's there was nothing. It's not because there were I knew that I couldn't tell George's version of the story in there. There was no way that could be published, so that was not in there. There was nothing in the book that was in any way sensational. if it ever gets if it ever does get published, people are going to be disappointed because there was nothing sensational in the book. It was just
But at
a
this
story
point now,
about,
everyone's like, well, there must be crazy stuff in this book.
Yeah.
no, it's just because it went over stuff that this is just my personal opinion, is that it went over stuff that they just didn't want to deal with again, because there had been a lot there. Harrison Ford had almost been killed. That's
right.
a well-known
Yeah,
fact.
yeah.
That George had gone public saying that his ideas were more or less discarded. These are all that they changed the release date. This is all public knowledge. My personal opinion is I just didn't want to rehash all of that. But
Makes sense.
there may be something totally different that I'm unaware of that caused it to be canceled.
Somebody has probably made the decision that thing will come out in 10 years, and it's sitting right next to those 30-year-old blueprints.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
So did you, just so I can understand this, did you have direct interaction with production of that movie did you have interactions with J.J. Abrams, with Kathleen Kennedy during that time?
Yeah, well, I was working there up till the release of the film. So I wasn't on set. Mark Vaz, who co-wrote the book with me, that's the other thing. It's a long story, but Mark Vaz was on set for about 3 weeks or so. So he was on set, but I was at the first ever meeting with J.J. Abrams and Kathleen Kennedy and his producers at Skywalker Ranch. There were a bunch of us around the table. And so I was there for that, and that was like the kickoff meeting. So that was very interesting. And then I sat in on a couple concept art meetings, and J.J. Abrams was there remotely. Most of the people were there remotely, several of the people were there remotely, and then most of the artists were there in the little sort of room at ILM in San Francisco. And I was talking to other people who were working on production throughout, because for one reason or another, because I was doing all the nonfiction books related to the film. There wasn't a lot of interaction. It wasn't like episode 3 at all, but I was part of the team, so to speak. And then for the actual Force Awakens book, I interviewed the main actors, and it was a regular book until it wasn't anymore.
Okay. Real quick from me here, in terms of J.J. Abrams' style of making movies, any relation to how George operates, or a completely different animal?
They're their own people. They do things in different ways.
Okay. Fair. Because I always felt like JJ was inspired by a Lucas and Spielberg type of thing, so he's from that ilk. So just curious about that. Okay, so this next question, Jeremy Shook, our new general on Patreon. How you doing?
Hey, there he is.
Did you ever want to write a fictional canon Star Wars book?
No, not particularly.
Okay.
I did write one for Indiana Jones. I wrote
cool.
I heard about that. Yeah.
That was really fun, but I hadn't decided to do it. I just had to fill in for the regular writer because he suddenly got sick and couldn't do the book, so I had like 6 weeks to do it. So I thought this will be fun, but no, I've never really wanted to.
Okay.
I did do I wanted to do more. I did an animated short, which is on YouTube. You can see it, called Riddle of the Black Cat, which is based on an Edgar Allan Poe short story. That's the kind of stuff.
I saw artwork for that on your website. I checked out earlier.
Yeah, Greg Knight did all the artwork for everything. The guy is amazing.
Yeah, it looks really cool.
That was a passion project.
Okay, last question from our listeners. Adam Odell, what's up, Adam? You kind of answered this a little bit earlier, but maybe you have one other person in mind you could mention. Who on the original production of the Star Wars films doesn't get enough credit and or doesn't get talked about enough for making Star Wars happen?
Well, for making it happen, it's Alan Ladd. Because without Alan Ladd at Fox, the movie definitely doesn't happen, period.
Okay.
He's the one who talked the board into giving it a green light. The myth that Ralph McQuarrie's artwork is a myth. I talked to a guy who was in the boardroom, and I would never can remember his name. He's a famous billionaire in San Francisco. And anyway, he was in the room, and I asked him, I said, so did Ralph McQuarrie's artwork have a huge influence on you guys? And he said, what? He didn't even know who Ralph McQuarrie was. He didn't remember seeing any artwork. He said, look, we're businessmen. We didn't know. If you show somebody a painting, it doesn't mean anything.
Right.
It doesn't mean nothing to people who are about to make a movie. And businessmen are going to, you're not going to be able to make that painting, he said.
They're like,
something
show
like that.
me the money.
Yeah, I said, Alan Ladd, we had confidence in. He was the head of production. He said, we have to have confidence in George Lucas. I think he's going to make a interesting movie. And that's the only reason why the movie was actually made. And Alan Ladd was the only one that I know of who actively defended production throughout and enabled them to get to the finish line. Because, they went way over budget, practically doubled the budget, although the budget wasn't realistic to begin with. Right. And then on production, I'd have to say John Barry, who we mentioned before. Mm-hmm. George would read the manuscript. I'd give him the manuscript for each making of book, and I'd give him, he'd have whatever time he needed to read it, and he read it very carefully, and he made very few corrections or hardly ever crossed anything out. But one of the few things he did was, I can't remember what I'd written. I said, John Barry was a veteran production designer or something like that, and George crossed out the word veteran and wrote genius. He was a genius production designer.
Imagine that compliment
awesome.
Coming from George.
That's
like, well, I'm done.
Yeah. That's a very, very high praise. And, Ralph McQuarrie, I really loved Ralph, and I spent time with him and was honored to be in the same room with him. And he's a fantastic artist. But being a production designer and being a concept artist are two very, very different things. And if you do a set-by-set analysis, I'm not sure, but, I believe most of the sets, were designed by John Barry and his team with input from Ralph and input from George. But, Ralph deserves all the credit he gets, but I think John Barry is probably the one who doesn't get enough credit.
Okay. Yeah.
Good answer.
That's a name. Like, cause if you study up on Star Wars and the cliff notes and stuff, even you hear those other names, but John Barry you don't hear very often. So
no, and because he died, as you know, while they were making Empire.
Mm-hmm.
He came back. He was going to direct his own movie. He got fired by Kirk Douglas, I believe, and then he came back. Basically, he needed to work, and George put him to work as second unit director on Empire, and he only was there for a few weeks, and then he died.
Oh, that's awful. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, on that note,
that cheery note.
that cheery note. That's it for the questions, and that's pretty much it. We don't want to take too much more of your time. So, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. I know you've probably done a billion of these, and I hope this was in any way a little bit unique. But thank you so much.
Yeah, no, it's fun. I hope I didn't put my foot in my mouth too many times in trying to think here.
I probably tried to get you to, but yeah.
I defended you. Don't worry. I got you out of there. Pulled you out.
That's right. Thank you very much.
But
it's fun. It's fun to geek out and talk about all this stuff. It's great.
Yeah, I feel like we could talk to you for hours. So if you're ever down to come back down the road sometime, we'd love to have you back.
Well, you guys only do Star Wars, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Because the Alien book comes out sometime this spring. It'd be fun to talk about that. Did you guys? You don't have to put this on the air, but did you guys see the Planet of the Apes book that came out last October?
Nope.
No, but those movies are awesome.
I did a book on the first Planet of the Apes, which I
with like Charlton Heston.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's really, really cool.
Yeah.
So listeners should be on the lookout for your Alien book coming out.
Yeah.
And your indie book and the
Star Wars
Planet of the
books,
Apes books, all the Star Wars books. And actually, while we have you, because our listeners love all sorts of stuff. So what other stuff, do you have stuff you're working on coming up in addition to that stuff? And where can they find your work, your website and stuff like that?
Well, like I said, if you want to see Riddle of the Black Cat, it's online, YouTube, and the links are on my website. I'm working on a few other books, but I don't think the marketing departments would be happy if I mentioned them yet. I mean, I've mentioned it other places, so I can say I wrote a book on Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, but we're still looking, strangely enough, for a publisher for that. And I'm hoping that'll eventually come out one day. That's another story. But yeah, there's
new material coming out for that too.
For the what? The Shining?
They're making a sequel to not the movie but the book.
Oh, right.
With Ewan McGregor, actually.
Stephen King wrote a sequel to the book.
Dr.
Sleep or something. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah.
They're making the Dr. Sleep movie with Ewan McGregor playing the son, all grown up.
Well, that's interesting. I'll go see that. If you guys want to talk about Star Wars another time, just let me know. I'm happy to be honored to come back.
Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
All right, guys. So that was it. We hope you enjoyed our interview, our discussion, our chat, whatever you want to call it, with J.W. Rinzler. We talked about a lot. I obviously tried to get him to spill some beans on some stuff. I had to try, guys. Really excited about you guys, your thoughts on this. So let us know in the comments what you think. Were there things you had no idea about, things that you were surprised about, things you want to hear in the future when we talk to them, all that stuff. I'm still trying to unpack this in my head right now. Guys, do you have any last minute thoughts on this?
I guarantee there are so many people who have already looked up or cannot wait to get to wherever they're driving to so that they can look up that Hayden Christensen.
It's driving me nuts. And the guy's like, and he panicked. It looked like he was like, did I say that in the book? Like,
right, yeah.
And I was like,
I'm actually really glad that I went back to clarify because we all kind of passed over it and we're like, okay, and I'm like,
because I was thinking like, I don't know, the end of the movie.
Yeah. Hold on one second. Can we go back here? Did you say that Hayden Christensen was reshooting scenes from Empire Strikes Back?
Yeah,
which would make sense though, because they had him as a Force ghost at the end of Return of the Jedi.
Well,
so maybe they had him shoot a bunch of stuff.
And here's the guy who did the making of these movies. He's on the set of Revenge of the Sith. I'm not going to be like, that's inaccurate.
Don't forget too that when they re-added Hayden Christensen into that the special edition, the first time was before the prequels. That was like our first on-screen Hayden Christensen Anakin. So they hadn't even shot episode 1 at that point. And this is episode 3. They're still going back and reshooting stuff with Hayden.
Right.
So, yeah. Because that was the special editions that were released before episode 1. But what he's talking about is on the set of episode 3.
Right.
Well, the
for
special
the
editions,
later.
We're mixing this stuff up here now because Hayden wasn't around for before episode 1. That's not true.
Because he has the long hair from.
You're thinking
Revenge
of between 2 and 3, they did stuff for the special editions.
They definitely shot him for the Force Ghost in between.
When did the Return of the Jedi special edition come out?
All right, so you had the original special edition come out, and we have to close this episode, but original special edition came out in 97. You had Phantom Menace come out in 99. Hayden comes around for 2002 with Attack of the Clones. They released the special edition on DVD in 2004. Then 2005, Revenge of the Sith comes out. So you can put together your
but when was
there.
the special edition for Empire Strikes Back?
Well,
Return of the Jedi.
The original trilogy special edition was 97. And then they re-released it. Then they re-released it in 2004 with the Hayden stuff in it. The original special edition did not have Hayden. It still had Sebastian Shaw.
The Blu-ray set has Hayden on it.
Yeah. And the DVD.
Oh. Yeah. Man, okay.
Anyway, it was super cool, and I was just like...
Yeah, so I thought it was great talking to him because I really felt like I took a time portal, even though he wasn't around for the original trilogy. Like, this guy, was with George and talking to him. I loved it. I had such a good time talking to him. I wish we had to have him back.
I can't recommend checking out his blog as well because his entire catalog of the history was crazy. I mean, it feels long at first, but it's so short when you think how much stuff he covers in that thing. And I felt like listening to his stories, and I'm like, yeah, I know, like he's told this one before. Like
maybe we should go into more details for Patreon.
Yeah.
All right, so guys, let's get out of here because we have other work to do. So make sure you guys subscribe to us on iTunes, SoundCloud, Spotify, and YouTube. Leave a comment and like our YouTube videos. We're trying to get these things to an average of 1,000 views each episode. We're getting closer. Keep doing it. Come on. We can do it. We can do this together. And then when we do, we'll get like other cool guests on here maybe. I don't know. But you guys, check out our Patreon pages. Lacey was just saying we have some other stuff we're going to be getting going on there. So head up patreon.com/resistance broadcast. We just hit our second goal, guys. So we're doing a commentary on J.W. Rinzler's favorite movie, A New Hope. So we're excited to get that out to you guys. So $2 a month, you can start right there on our Patreon page. You guys can find me on Twitter at Johnny Hoey and over at StarWarsNewsNet.com. James, how about you?
At Myra Trunks, you guys know where it is.
He's back, baby. James Baney is back, folks.
I was
Lacey,
back on Monday.
People can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Lacey Gilleran. And I would just like to say, months ago, we talked about what books we'd want to see. And I said a certain point of view, but with that behind the scenes stories. JW is my certain point of view behind the scenes stories.
Yeah, I'm picking up all his books now. I'm going to the local Home Goods and I'm gonna outbuy Lacey and buy all the books up.
That is pretty crazy. Like he just sold so many more copies just by coming on the show.
Hey, without a doubt. Because like I've seen, although like I was saying, all those photos online, everything you see about Star Wars memes and stuff, they're all from this guy's his research. So
I love that he knew the pink shorts photo.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And the Peter Mayhew smoking with the Kenny Baker and the Playboy shirt is my favorite. But all right, guys. So this is Thursday. So enjoy your weekends. We will be back with you on Monday with another awesome episode, hopefully. I'm still trying to unwind this stuff. Absolutely crazy. But enjoy your weekends. We'll see you on Monday with another episode right here on the Resistance broadcast. See you around, kids. Bye.
Bye.